The Dungeon Master Experience is a series of articles written by Chris Perkins in Dungeon Magazine in 2011. The following readings are his words, and though produced before the current edition, still contains great insights, advice, and tips for Dungeon Masters for any edition, and for that matter, any TTRPG. T-Wit, 9/1/2011, Wednesday night. Kale, the party cleric, lies dead, killed by the evil pirate warlord Vantajar moments before the warlord himself meets his end. Before Kale's bodily remains can be salvaged, the enormous water elemental powering Vantajar's warship escapes captivity and sinks the vessel. The surviving heroes flee into an extra-dimensional space. They are epic level after all, and so avoid plunging into a sea of acid in the elemental chaos. Chris Champagne, Kale's player, jumps on the chance to play a new character, and I spend the rest of the session trying to facilitate this character's introduction. I'm not a fan of new characters showing up inexplicably to a chorus of voices exclaiming, "You look untrustworthy." No, I much prefer well-staged entrances. Remember Captain Jack Sparrow's entrance in Pirates of the Caribbean? Yeah, it doesn't get better than that. Chris's new character is Kosh, an infernal pact warlock with the Prince of Hell epic destiny. After the surviving characters use the plane shift ritual to get back to their own ship, I orchestrate a role-playing encounter in which Tyranny, the succubus concubine of the ship's captain, concocts a ritual to summon Kosh from the Nine Hells. Tyra, as she's known, is convinced that the party could use the extra firepower, but a ritual requires 9 drops of blood from 9 different mortals, and being an immortal, she has only the crew members aboard the hero's ship to choose from. She must also convince the player characters that this is a good idea, and that having an epic level Prince of Hell in the party has certain advantages. Suffice to say, it's not an easy sell. In fact, it proves to be a very hard sell, and takes more than an hour of back and forth role-playing and conniving on my part to make it happen. Meanwhile, Chris remains silent for most of the session, jotting down notes about his character's background as I do everything in my power to bring caution to play. Everything except shout to the players, "Look guys, Chris has a new character he wants to play, so stop role-playing already and let him play." I'm so glad I didn't have to say that. Thanks to a rash of conventions and summer vacations, many of us at Wizards are playing catch-up around the office. The interruptions have also impacted my Monday and Wednesday night campaign and thrown me off my game. To wit, last week was the first time in a long time that I sat down at the game table and couldn't remember where we'd left off the previous session. I had to check my notes to realize, oh yeah, the players are smack dab in the middle of the biggest battle of the campaign. DM spaz moments aside, I run a very brisk game, as evidenced by watching the games I run for Acquisitions Incorporated and the writers of Robot Chicken. When I look back at my notes from the previous Wednesday night session, I see a long list of stuff that happened that needs to be organized and recapped for the players and my benefit. It also reminds me that a DM has the power to propel the campaign forward at a staggering pace with a few simple tricks. This installment of the Dungeon Master Experience discusses the ancient art of contraction as it pertains to D&D game sessions. My impetus for tackling the subject from some recent encounters with DMs at conventions. One question I get asked from time to time is, how do you pack so much stuff into one session? I'm guessing that many DMs have experienced occasions when the campaign loses all forward momentum and plods along at an insufferable pace, either because the players lack motivation or because the players get distracted by too much nonsense. In English grammar, we use contractions to neatly dispose of unnecessary letters and syllables in conversation and informal writing. I'm is shorter and takes microseconds less time to write and say than I am. I contract my campaign in much the same way. On a per example basis, it doesn't amount to much, but a minute saved here and there really starts to add up in a 4-hour game session. Here are a few specific tactics I use. I cut my campaign the way a film director cuts a movie. If I find the session is lagging, I jump ahead as far as I reasonably can without causing the narrative to become disjointed. It might be rounds, minutes, hours, days, or months. but I do my best to encapsulate the skipped time period and press on. In my Wednesday night game, the ritual that Tyranny casts to summon Kosh from the Nine Hells happens very quickly, in real time, because I wanted to give Chris a chance to play. But at the same time, his entrance needs to be memorable yet appropriate, and so I go the route of a giant flaming pentagon. To take a more common example, if the characters are spending too much time shopping for gear in town, I might say, after a couple of hours spent gearing up in town, you find everything you need and head east, following the edge of a vast dry canyon. 6 hours later, as the sun begins to set, you descend into the canyon and make camp near a fat cactus that provides ample water. The couple sentences, I can push the story along and skip over countless wasted minutes. Using subtlety and guile, I help players get past points of indecision. If the players are mired in indecision, I have an NPC offer them a well-reasoned opinion or bit of sound advice, or I give a player some free bit of information his or her character could logically know. I use this technique a lot as my way of telling the players, the DM thinks you ought to do this, as opposed to that. Sometimes my players will ignore the advice, but that's more because I have, on occasion, used NPCs to deliberately feed them bad information and advice. A topic which, by the way, really deserves its own article. I keep my descriptions spare. If the characters are hired to escort a merchant caravan from town A to town B, and I've staged the encounter with bandits at some point in between, I take one sentence to describe the caravan, and one sentence to describe the journey from town A to the bandit encounter. Then, if I feel so inclined, I add a sentence that describes a few pertinent or offbeat character moments, involving the PCs and/or significant NPCs. For example, shortly before nightfall on the first day of travel, one of the merchants uncorks a cask of dwarven whiskey and passes out flagons. Those of you who partake of the whiskey find it difficult to stay awake during your watch. These sentences might include inconsequential details to give the campaign color, but I don't dwell on stuff that isn't important. If players want more information, such as the brand of dwarven whiskey, they'll usually ask for it. I keep my NPCs' descriptions brief as well. In the Wednesday night games, the adventurers recently faced their arch-nemesis for the first time. My description of Vantajar, the Dragonborn pirate warlord, was that he was 9 foot tall, unnaturally large for his species, and had a metal eye patch bolted to his skull, a la General Chang, Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. Everything else was left to the players' imaginations. I generally like to give an NPC one distinguishing characteristic before moving on. I don't front-load information. I let it trickle out in dribs and drabs, and not just because I can always provide more information if the players ask for it. As the DM, I control the pace of the game, and if it takes me 5 painful long minutes to describe the contents of a room, chances are good that players will fail to pick up or remember important details that will then need to be repeated. My players don't need to know that a balcony is 20 feet high until that information becomes relevant. I keep track of initiative on a magnetic whiteboard. That way the players can see when their turns are coming up and plan accordingly. Giving them visibility into the combat order reduces the number of wasted minutes during a player's turn. I exhibit a low tolerance for player indecision in combat. Combat is supposed to be fluid and fast, and nothing causes the game to grind to a halt faster than an indecisive player who can't decide what actions his character is going to take on his turn. I will press the player with questions such as, what does your character do? If this doesn't push the player to swift action, I ask, would you like to delay? Which, if answered in the affirmative, lets me skip forward until the player decides he's ready to jump back in. Other favorite sayings of mine include, you can always use an at-will power, or do whatever feels right for your character. Another thing I do is have a monster or NPC verbally taunt or insult the character, which often incites the player to take immediate action against the offending enemy. I also break the lull with a touch of role-playing. I ignore a lot of conditions and ongoing damage effects. Ongoing damage and conditions such as slowed and weakened are useful in moderation, but they slow down the game. I urge novice DMs to avoid them like the plague. I would rather have a monster deal straight up damage than apply rider effects that need to be tracked, unless they're part of the monster's shtick. Since most ongoing damage effects end after one round anyway, it's faster and easier to have a monster that deals ongoing 10 damage. Simply deal 10 extra damage on the initial attack and be done with it. I dump irrelevant encounters. I imagine every encounter as a scene in a movie script and decide for myself whether it's worth preserving or not. Even a minor encounter should advance the campaign narrative in some way or provide interesting character moments. At the very least, it should present a challenge unlike anything the players have faced before. If the players are suffering through their 6th random wilderness encounter in a row, I've done something horribly wrong. Sometimes it hurts to cut stuff. Case in point, I had to cut a bunch of planned moments from this year's live D&D at PAX purely due to time constraints, including a cool bit where the Dark Magic Mansion decides it doesn't like Binwin Bronzebottom and turns against him. A pity, but that's just the way it is. I sometimes use average damage values. Average damage used consistently, and to excess is boring and predictable. 2 things a DM never wants to be accused of being. Still, it's tech we've applied to minions with great success. In a given session, I roll lots of dice, and adding up numbers takes time. When running complex combat encounters, I alternate between rolling damage for monsters and taking average damage. I have a chart similar to the one below attached to my DM screen, and for the record, treat monster recharge powers as encounter powers when determining average damage for them. Lessons learned. One analogy I'm fond of using is that a D&D campaign is like a wagon. Players are the horses and the DM is the driver holding the reins. As the players move forward, they take the campaign and you along with them. You can guide them to a point, but they can be stubborn, hard to motivate, or just plain out of control. Sometimes you have to snap their reins. But if you crack the whip too often and keep the players running at full speed all the time, they'll get worn out. So you need to set a pace that's comfortable for them, but also gets the wagon where it needs to go. When it comes to setting a brisk pace, there are dozens of tactics I use to cram more gaming time into my game session, some of which are better witnessed than explained, but most of them boil down to being aggressive in my efforts to focus players on the important stuff and get them past distractions that might lead the campaign astray, cause the pace to slow to a crawl, or reduce the player's overall sense of fun. I'm sure you have your own tried and true tricks for packing more punch into your game sessions, and I'd love to hear about them. With regard to my Wednesday night game, it takes a special kind of player to sit still for an hour while his friends decide whether or not to let him play. Had I been on my game, I would have found a way to contract the back and forth debate about the merits of summoning a Prince of Hell so that Chris could put his cool new character in play. Still, I'm glad I didn't go the route of having Kosh magically appear out of nowhere and ask, "Anyone need an Infernal Warlock?" Talk about dumb. P.S. Thanks to everyone who voted in last week's poll. The Heroes of Acquisitions Incorporated made short work of Gygax the cat. For once it appears the butler didn't do it. Until the next encounter. Also, don't forget to follow the link in the description to pick up my first ever adventure and setting for free on Patreon and DriveThruRPG now. Dive into the desert region of Gondolar as adventurers making their way to the budding city town of Silt Pass in search of gold, glory, and answers to the secrets of a long-lost empire. In this first adventure, your heroes will defend the Dune Dancer, a sandcutter airship from a legendary group of bandits known as the Stormbringers. Do you have what it takes to stop the Stormbringers and their bombastic leader Tharok, or will you make a deal with the devil of the sands and join them? Decide your destiny in the first of 6 adventures. TSI, Tharok, Stormbringer, Ironmane.